The reviews are in, and everybody seems to love John Wick 4, which I cannot fathom how. What the hell happened with this movie? Well, in 2020, following the release of John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum, the annoyingly only one with a subtitle, John Wick 4 and 5 were both greenlit to be filmed back-to-back as the final conclusion to the series. The movie was written and developed with this in mind and began production. Then, during the production of John Wick 4, news subtly leaked that plans had changed, and John Wick 5 was being shelved. They were going to just film John Wick 4, and man, that really shows. Because of all the movies in the franchise, Chapter 4 has been bar none the weakest one so far. This movie felt like two different movies were cut in half and meshed together. The narrative is all over the place, and it spends the entire runtime undoing the impact of the previous movie that came right before it. I hope you've either seen it or don't care about spoilers because I'm about to give away the entire movie. The opening is actually really phenomenal. In the bottom of a subway, we see John training and recovering from all the damage done to him in the last movie. Lawrence Fishburne's character walks through the subway talking to himself before referencing Dante's Inferno from the Divine Comedy, quoting, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Like we're in for a journey through hell, which, I mean, not quite. After this roughly 5-minute setup, I was instantly disappointed. John somehow gets across the ocean back to Casablanca and finds the elder who sits above the table, which was like a huge deal in the last movie. You don't find the elder, he finds you. Well, all of that is out the window so we can have John find the elder in the actual first 10 minutes of the movie. All of that set up in the third movie undone, as if it was a secondary plot thread they wanted to resolve and get out of the way because they had a way better idea to introduce and they didn't want to keep working on the original thread the third movie had started. He demands his ring from the elder, who informs him that he is not the same elder from the third movie, and he does not have the ring. So this whole scene is a waste of our time. It's pointless. It would potentially matter if this was like setting up for the fifth movie for him to go and get his ring back from the table, but it's not that, because there won't be a fifth movie. At least not one continuing the story of these 4 movies. The whole second act of the third movie is about John finding the elder who sits above the table. He has to use his only marker to get a meeting with the person who can even set up how he can put himself in a position for the elder to find him. Wandering the desert for actual days with practically no water is the only way to find him. Not to mention there's that whole thread about how he can't even get out of New York without people trying to kill him, so he has to cut his ticket or whatever, tear his ticket, so that his old orphanage will actually take him to Casablanca so he can set all of this up. And the fourth movie, the way he gets from New York to Casablanca again, despite there still being a target on his head, is magic. I'm assuming, because they never explain it, because this movie has no continuity whatsoever. So how did John find the elder? How did we resolve this huge plot point from the third movie where he cut off his finger and gave his wedding ring, the last physical reminder of the woman he loved so much, to this powerful figure who speaks for and sits above the high table? No clue. And it apparently doesn't matter, because all of this is shown in the first 10 minutes. He found the elder, somehow, which isn't even the same elder because, well, I have a theory for that, actually. I have an infuriating theory, and it's one that I believe permeates the whole movie and actually ruins the story. At first I thought maybe the actor for the original elder died, and that's why they replaced him, but no, he's alive. They picked a different character for the elder, because the original elder left with John's ring. So we get no resolution to that thread. The reason is because, and this is just my theory, because the elder is still alive and will continue to play a huge role. In what, you might ask? The fucking spin-offs. They're doing a Continental series set within the universe, they're doing a ballerina movie starring Ana de Armas, and probably a whole movie centered around 2 of the other characters they introduced in this movie. So they couldn't kill the real elder because I believe they want him to play a role in these other movies and series, but the entire plot of John Wick 4 only happens because John Wick kills the elder. This was having their cake and eating it too, at the expense of the viewer. I'll get more into this theory as we go, but before I continue, let me say this up front. I think John Wick 4 and 5 were going to be about John dismantling the high table and bringing down this entire assassin organization. A poetic existence and explanation for why he keeps getting pulled back into these situations, like a divine purpose. He talks a lot about how he was a bad person who didn't deserve the 5 years of comfort he had with his wife before she died, and wouldn't it almost feel like fate if he had to pay penance for that by being the one who destroyed this organization that he helped manifest? Raised practically from birth as an orphan to be an assassin, he helped build this whole thing. It would make the movies feel tied together, like it's the story of him undoing what he helped build. That's what he did in John Wick 1 after all. The Russian mob boss literally says, "The bodies John Wick buried laid the foundation for what they had." So the overarching story of this series seems like it would emulate that. The dismantling of the high table and an end to this world of assassins. But of course that would be expecting Hollywood to have competent writers, and we don't get to have that, so of course none of that happens. Not even a taste of it, actually. Yeah, that would be an over-the-top and insane storyline, but after this movie, that pitch seems more believable than half the stunts in this movie. I genuinely believe that this was the original intent. Looking at John Wick 2, and especially 3, with the adjudicator and the high table incessantly being a thorn in everyone's side, the third movie even ends with Lawrence Fishburne saying how tired he is of all of this high table shit, and sets it up like they're planning to go to war over it all. The subtitle of the third movie is Parabellum, which so perfectly sets up the idea that if you want peace, prepare for war. War with the high table. John Wick wants peace, he wants to live peacefully, so the only way he can achieve that peace is to prepare for war, have a war with the high table, and dismantle what he helped build. Which of course never really happens. I mean, we get the skirmish at the end of the third movie, but it ends in a parlay that grants Winston his hotel back at the expense of his friendship with John. Which that whole exchange is meaningless after the fourth movie. John Wick 4 does more to undo everything about the movies before it than it does to pay them off. All of this, I believe, is because the studios wanted to kill the fifth movie and not destroy the high table, because they wanted the universe to persist and become spin-offs and more money makers and desperation for that sweet, sweet connected universe Marvel money. Oh, yeah, the movie. Pennywise shows up next and blows up the New York Continental Hotel they worked so hard to reinstate last movie, rendering that entire sequence meaningless as well. And hey, bring in Mr. Krabs to deliver the bad news to Winston and say he's a harbinger, which is so annoying. Clancy Brown did really well with his performance, but you had a fantastic and incredibly unlikable character in the Adjudicator. I wanted her back, and I especially wanted her to die. But whatever, that was more of a personal thing I had, and I'd have used her for Clancy Brown's role. But Clancy did fine, so whatever, bring Mr. Krabs in, I guess. Meanwhile, Winston is called into an intimidation meeting with Pennywise and has to watch his friend, Lance Reddick's concierge character, get killed. Which, rest in peace, Lance. His character was always a favorite of mine. And his in-universe death brings about the theme of John Wick 4, which is friendship. All of these movies establish a theme, and they really deliver the story based around that theme. The first movie was greed and revenge. The second movie was the importance and dangers of rules. The third movie was the consequences of breaking rules. And in John Wick 4, it's the meaning of friendship. Which I know sounds really stupid, but it's actually one of the things I really loved about this movie, because it does handle it in a really sincere and powerful way. Which brings us into the real meat of the movie. Pennywise's character, the Marquise de Gramont, hires one of John Wick's old friends, a blind assassin played by Donnie Yen, to kill John Wick or his daughter will potentially be killed. Donnie Yen's character is named Kane. Yes, they named the blind assassin Kane. And he reluctantly agrees to seek out and assassinate John Wick, and we are then taken to Osaka for the second best sequence in the entire movie. John Wick has found refuge in the Japanese Continental Hotel, much to the dismay of the manager's concierge and daughter, because she knows they will come for him eventually. The manager is named Koji Shimazu, and played by the amazing Hiroyuki Sanada, who owns this role, and I am convinced he was the live-action inspiration for Goro Takamura in Cyberpunk 2077. John is seen brooding on the Japanese building's rooftop overlooking the city when Koji approaches him. John thanks him for giving him refuge and helping him, then apologizing for putting him in danger, to which Koji gives what I think is the most important line of the entire movie. Friends mean little when it's convenient, which sums up the best part of this movie's narrative. This becomes a pretty major theme. After this, the Marquis sends his kill force to the Osaka Continental to raid the place looking for John Wick. And we get what I think is probably the best fight sequence of the film. For the next 20 minutes, it's pretty much constant fighting. The most notable of which is when Koji fights Kane, because when Kane asks why Koji is helping John despite owing him nothing and having no marker, Koji rebukes him and tells him that not everything is about rules and the high table, bringing in the stinging recognition of the presence of that looming overarching villain, and pointing out that Kane has lost his honor. This is where Koji is killed by Kane and his daughter swears vengeance. After this sequence, everything gets worse, and I really started to realize what this movie really is. It's filler facading as a conclusion. Nothing happens after this point that has anything to do with the previous 3 movies, and none of it matters because, and you may have guessed this by now, John dies in the end, and in the stupidest way imaginable. After the Japan scene, John goes back to New York to visit Winston, where Winston asks John, "Where does it all end?" John says he will kill the Marquis, and Winston says, "What then?" And then Winston reveals the duel option. Duel ex machina. These movies have a really bad habit of writing themselves out of precarious situations by making up lore, and it stopped being cute after the 3rd movie. At this point, it just feels like a cheap tool from bad writers. According to the old rules of the high table, if John is a member of a family that sits at the table, he can then challenge the Marquis to a duel, and if he wins, ensure his freedom from the table. Winston suggests this option instead of outright killing the Marquis, because then John would be free. Well, John just wants to kill the Marquis, so he figures maybe this is the best way. The real reason Winston wants this, however, is so he can be reinstated as the head of a rebuilt New York Continental. What happens after this is like 2 hours of filler. Yes, there's a lot of really sick fight scenes, including a continuous one-take fight scene in a building that is probably the coolest scene in the movie, but it's all utterly meaningless. The only parts of this movie that matter are the first 15 and the last 15 minutes. Everything in between is just mind-numbing action without any stakes or purpose. When we finally get to the end of the movie, John ends up dueling Kane, who is nominated in the place of the Marquis. Since they're old friends, John doesn't want to kill Kane. The duel happens and John wounds Kane and then tricks the Marquis into finishing the duel. John then shoots the Marquis in the head, and John then dies on the steps of the building they dueled at. This accomplishes 2 things: freeing Kane and his daughter, characters that we were introduced to in this movie, one of which we never actually see on screen, from the servitude of the Marquis, a character who was also only introduced in this movie. The second thing is giving Winston back his hotel, which, coincidentally, we already watched at the end of the 3rd movie. It was the entire 3rd act of the last film. Also, John dies having accomplished nothing of any meaning in this movie, including not even getting his ring back from the Elder when he cut his finger off. So when he went to Casablanca in the 3rd movie and it was this whole ordeal about how hard it is to find the Elder and he chopped off his finger, yeah, all of that is meaningless because they undo it in this one. John Wick 4 actually means nothing, and I realized this when I said to my girlfriend after we saw it that anyone could be better off just watching the original 3 and never seeing this one. Then, when I said the cliffhanger might entice one to watch the 4th one, I realized it also doesn't matter because there's no payoff. This movie's basically standalone. I will say, John Wick 4 was incredibly well made, well shot, and well acted. It is a brilliant display of filmmaking. I don't even want to say it's badly written, because if this was the only John Wick movie, I'd probably love it. But it's such an awful continuation and conclusion of the 3 previous films that it makes me feel like all of that escalation and growth from the last ones meant nothing. Because they meant nothing. Remember when John Wick gave his car to John Luigi Leguizamo to have it fixed in John Wick 2, and he says that he can fix it? That's like a pretty major fucking plot point in the first movie, is that car. Wouldn't it have made an immense amount of sense to have it play a role in the 4th and final movie? Well, you don't see either of those two ever again after that scene in the 2nd movie. Instead, we see a car that looks eerily similar to his muscle car, but it's in France and he just happens upon it and drives that car around in the 3rd act. Remember how mad the Bowery King was about his 7 cuts and being sick of all this high table nonsense? That actually goes nowhere. He ends up being a support character to John's quest to get out of his obligation on the high table. I'll tell you what John Wick 4 feels like. It feels like the 4th movie in a 5-movie series. Or actually, it really feels like a video game set in between the 3rd and 4th movie. Those interesting characters from the original movies have been turned into support characters and quest givers. If there was a 5th movie where we finally saw John topple the high table, I'd be so much more forgiving of all of this, but John is dead. So instead, this feels like an unsatisfying and cheap conclusion. If it literally ended on the 3rd movie hinting at what happens next, it would have been better than all of this. That being said, yes, it's possible John faked his death and is still alive, but I cannot be the only one who would feel utterly cheated by that kind of fake out, right? John Wick has to die. I wanted him to die, his death is fine with me, and a warrior's death like the director said he wanted makes sense, but what we have here is to the equivalent of Luke Skywalker dying at the end of Empire. Now maybe I'm being too harsh or perhaps not harsh enough. Judging by the reviews and immense praise this movie has gotten, I can tell I'm in the fringe minority on this issue. So I've asked a friend of mine to come on who specializes in tearing movies like this apart. What do you think, ER?
Hold on, Evan, let me just finish up watching this real quick. Whew, boy, finally. Now, I've never really been a fan of these Transformer movies, but... Oh, you meant Wick, not Locke, leader of the Dinobots. My bad, hard not to get these action series mixed up where they do the same thing for over 2 hours. More like John Thick, am I right? Alright, give me a sec, or 10,000. I'll be right back. God damn, I lost count of how many times Wick rolled to the ground, grabbed a goon by his legs, and shot the dude in the face. Pretty impressive stuff. The first 5 times. Don't get me wrong, action schlock friends, I love action. I love schlock. One of my favorite movie series is the Mission Impossible series. Just brimming with schlocky action sequences, great stunt work, and goofy plots, each iteration goofier than the next. But here's how I would differentiate them from something like John Wick. Their set pieces have actual piece setup, with characters expositing how their impossible mission is supposed to play out before everything goes impossibly wrong. Then we get the shooty bang bang and running and car chases and whatnot. It's not all continuous, unyielding shoot-em-ups. They're divided into clear-cut segments that do a lot to help pace the gratuitous action. Wick, though, he ain't much of a planner. He just walks into any situation with arrogance only a man wearing the spiffiest plot armor money can buy, shoots his way out of every situation, and that's kind of it. I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but that's really kind of the gist of these movies. And to be fair, it is part of the charm of them. It just gets a little old after, again, nearly 3 hours. I have to admit to a bias here, as I'm not as huge a Wick fan as Evan here, so my memory of the 2nd and 3rd movies is paper thin at best. However, I want it on the record, I think the first John Wick is a masterclass of an action flick, to the point I'd call it a favorite, so I remember it well. For one thing, it helps being a whole hour fucking shorter than this one, thank dog. For another, it's structured almost entirely different from its sequels. While John's aim in movies 2 through 4 is to escape past circumstances relevant to those movies, one is distinct as a wish-fulfillment revenge flick. The careless son of a Russian mob lord kills John's dog, therefore anyone who gets in the way of John killing that kid is fodder asking for it. The fun of it is Wick mechanically shooting wave after wave of enemy to get to the snot-nosed brat who absolutely deserves it. I too would want to kill, how many was it? 70-something people? If they so much as messed with my pup, so I get it. It's such an enjoyable, cheesy premise that a god of death will slaughter every last rusky gangster in the mafia just to avenge his dog, and you can't help but have fun rooting for the guy as he undergoes a fuck ton of really fun action. I fucking love that movie. The hints of an assassin underworld with rules and customs was the icing on the cake, and I preferred it as background flavoring because it wasn't what I was specifically there for, which was to watch a Terminator gun his way through tens of people with the single-minded goal of revenge. And that's pretty much gone by John Wick 2, which instead delves into that excessively rule-bound, lore-ridden underworld with its customs and practices. The so-called boogeyman is instead yanked around on a leash like he's the dog by this secret society he finds himself trapped in again. And in 3, in my opinion, it worsened. John even allows a dog to be shot in front of him and has next to zero reaction to it because in that scene he's not really allowed to react yet as he's chained to the society's rules. 4 continues to exacerbate this trend of John being at the mercy of this world, where otherwise intriguing how did they do that action stunts blear together as our titular character attempts to merely survive. I'm unsure why he even wishes to live so badly, frankly, while people around him with significantly more reason to live, with people they still have to live for, such as Koji, die for his sake. Regardless, some of the set pieces were a lot of fun, like John in a firefight in the roundabout orbiting the Arc de Triomphe. I was laughing my ass off, for good reasons, as the cheese factor was through the proverbial, or as the French say, proverbial roof. These Frenchmen won't stop for shit, not for a dozen different during car crashes or an active firefight in the middle of the road. A frog never surrenders on the way home from work. Watching all these contract killers be accosted by speeding cars was as intense as it was really fucking funny. Then there was this video-esque sequence where they filmed a set from the top down in clear inspiration, I think, of Hotline Miami. And hey, I took a lot of enjoyment from it. But a handful of great set pieces does not make 2.5 hours of excessive shooty bang bang less of a repetitive slog. No matter how good the rest of the action, no matter how incredible the stunt work. Well, except the club sequence, which was garbage compared to almost the exact same sequence done in one. There just had to be more than this for this movie to me, and I have next to no interest in the nitty-gritty rules and regulations of this secret society forwarding the plot. Hell, even John doesn't appear to care much. It's like some massive nuisance to him too, as he does his darndest to maneuver them. How did the boogeyman of John Wick 1 go from the most frightening presence in the underworld to a guy with a bounty on his head that randos will commit suicide lemming style to collect? John could be in a damn nursing home trying to finish his Jell-O cup when suddenly, the High Table's elderly rehabilitation home is deconsecrated, and a long-suffering John is forced to dodge every nurse hatchet and kill everyone in the rec center with a plastic spoon. By the way, I can't believe they named the blind assassin Kane. Even I wouldn't go that far. Furthermore, if I had $20 million for every time Donnie Yen played a blind assassin, I'd have $40 million, which while a fuck ton of greens still wouldn't be enough for me to commit suicide, but it's enough for everyone in this movie to for some reason. Also, what's with badass gun-toting bounty hunters dying on steps? Watanabe-san deserves some royalties at this point. Overall, if you like well-done action, and a lot of it over and over and over again for 2.5 hours, with one fairly convoluted narrative gluing it together, you'll love John Wick 4. And as Evan says, there are themes for each movie, whether or not you care for them personally, like me, but this fourth one does do kind of a terrible job following it through and concluding these movies. So if you care about that stuff, you're really gonna have to turn your brain off more than normal for this one. On a final note, who the fuck is taking care of John's pitbull now? Did they put him in a shelter? Think of all the kids the High Table could have it assassinate. What a waste. Well, can't wait for Ballerina. Behind every successful franchise about a man, there's a woman to finish the job. I'm sure we'll all be here for that one.
And it'll probably suck.